Graham, I've been reading your work. I've been listening to you speak. I've been watching from the sidelines as you've gone up against some of the most hardened institutions that society has. And it's been a fascinating journey, frankly. Just allowing that perspective into my young mind when I did come across your work. And your body of work is huge. It's broad, it's deep. And frankly, when I was thinking of how I want to take this conversation, I could have probably gone any direction. I could have picked a place in the map and just started doubling down on that, and it would have made sense. But I thought, since we're speaking to India, I wanted to talk about India.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting aspects about Indian history and Indian people now is that whether people have an academic sense for it or not, all Indians grow up with the suspicion that we are way older than what modern history tells us.
Yeah.
We don't need proof for that, for that matter. I think part of it is because mythology is so integrated into the Indian psyche.
Yeah.
We feel like an extension of the stories we grew up hearing.
Yeah.
We never question it.
Yeah.
And I think it adds magic to a lot of our lives.
I agree.
But from your point of view, how old do you think is the Indian civilization? And if it's older than what they say, which is about 4,500 years ago, what do you think erased its history?
Well, Indian civilization is definitely significantly older than 4,500 years ago. Academics tend to focus on the Indus Valley civilization, but even there, you have a background which goes back thousands of years before that. There's the Indus Valley civilization doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It has a background. Look, my interest and my issue for the more than 30 years has been, is it possible that there has been a forgotten episode in human history, a missing chapter? That is not an idea that those who are entrusted with effectively the control of our past, archaeologists, they don't like that idea. They like to feel that it's all very tidy, and in a way that we today, the modern humans, are the apex and the pinnacle of the human story. And in a way, they look at the human story as being all about us. It's all directed towards us. That we're somehow the end product of this long linear progression. And I don't think it is linear. I think, and this is where Indian mythology and Indian philosophy becomes very important, because it is one of the, not the only, but it's one of the few systems in the world where the cyclical nature of time is recognized, and where the possibility of huge cataclysms bringing an end to an era of the earth is recognized and actually fundamental. And this is the Yuga theory in India. Once you become embedded in the Yuga theory, it becomes perfectly natural to think that what we have now will not stay forever. It will change. It will go down. Our civilization, I've often said, ticks all the boxes for the next lost civilization. And I think India is one of the few areas which has got that built in structurally into the way that it thinks about the past. So we have the Yugas, and then we have the concept of the pralaya, the great cataclysm that follows the Yuga. And one of the things I've been very interested in is that the Yuga system uses a sequence of numbers. The Kali Yuga is supposed to last for 432,000 years. These, and actually all of the numbers of the different Yugas are all divisible by the number 72. This is a very curious thing. And what it's about, this intersects with another aspect of my work, is ancient knowledge of astronomy. And it's very clear that despite what our historians of science say, there was a very advanced knowledge of astronomy, not 1,000, not 2,000, not 5,000, more than 10, perhaps 15, perhaps 20, perhaps 30,000 years ago. It's hard to put a beginning date on it. And that is knowledge of a phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes. Like so many scientific achievements, Western historians of science just give it to the Greeks. They just give it to the Greeks. But they're wrong because knowledge of the precession of the equinoxes is far older than the Greeks. The Greeks just grabbed it from much older cultures, one of which was India. The key thing about the precession of the equinoxes is that it unfolds at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. And it's a cycle of 25,920 years. So if your pole star today is Polaris, over the next 26,000 years, that pole star is going to change because the axis of the Earth is doing this. That's the wobble on the axis of the Earth. And it's going to change at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. So also the zodiacal constellation that houses the sun, that the sun rises against the background of on the spring equinox, that will also change at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. So it's fascinating that the Yuga system is built around the number 72, and that all the yugas are, the length of all the yugas is divisible by the number 72. And that suggests to me an ancient knowledge that there's something to do with precession and cataclysms, that these two things happen together, and a message appears to have been sent down to us from the past. Knowledge of a phenomenon that nobody's supposed to know about until about 2,200 years ago is clearly evident thousands and thousands of years before that. And I think the ancient astronomy of India is one of the many areas that needs to be taken into account when we consider the age of civilization in India. You know, the whole notion of a lost civilization, which has been my focus. I have never for a single second, I'm looking at the Ice Age. I believe that this happened during the Ice Age. In a sense, we're still in an Ice Age. We're in what's called an interstadial, a gap between very cold periods. But if we've lost a whole civilization, that's when it happened. It happened during the last Ice Age. Look, we have certain numbers that we know about. We know that anatomically modern humans, the earliest firm evidence for anatomically modern humans is about 310,000 years ago. It's quite recent, really. It may well be that anatomically modern humans existed for long before that. But in terms of my research, I think it's interesting to look at the last 300,000 years when anatomically modern humans have been around. And during that time, if I were looking for a lost civilization, the last place on Earth I would look for it would be Northern Europe or North America, because these areas during the Ice Ages were frozen wildernesses. They were basically uninhabitable. Nobody with half a brain would have chosen to base a civilization there. The place for a civilization to emerge and grow up is in the tropics. It's closer to the equator, which was much less badly affected by the Ice Age. Yes, sea level was lower, but actually India enjoyed a positive and nurturing climate during the Ice Age, whereas Northern Europe was a complete disaster. So I've always felt that the places to look for traces of a lost civilization are close to the equator and in the tropics, and India perfectly fits the bill. And we know that sea level rise. See, when you have an Ice Age, what happens with rainfall is that it is frozen onto vast ice sheets on top of the continental land masses. And that means that sea level goes down. So sea level was 120 meters, about 400 feet lower at the peak of the Ice Age than it is today. That's a very radical difference. That's 27 million square kilometers of land that were above water 21,000 years ago that are underwater today. And if you look at the parts of the world that were radically affected by that sea level rise, India is one of them, particularly the Gulf of Kambat, up in the northwest, moving over towards Dwarka, and down in the south of India, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and the connections to Sri Lanka. I mean, everybody's heard of Rama's Bridge, but that was a real thing. Sri Lanka and India were actually physically joined during the Ice Age because sea level was so much lower. And although there's a certain amount of speculation with sea level rise issues, it's pretty clear that the Maldives were much larger during the Ice Age than they are today. So suddenly we can envisage an Indian landmass which does not look the way India looks today, but which extends much further to the south and which has important extensions up in the northwest and the northeast as well. And that makes it a very interesting place to look for a lost civilization. It's not the only place. I would draw attention also to the Sunda Shelf around Indonesia, which is where the Malaysian peninsula and the Indonesian islands were all joined into a massive landmass during the Ice Age. And this is something that a lot of the scholars who are working in this field just don't get, is how radically different the world looked during the Ice Age. How the best real estate on Earth, those coastal lands that were above water then, are now underwater. And very hard to research. It's not that academics, that archaeologists do no marine archaeology. They do. And there's some good marine archaeology being done in India by the National Institute of Oceanography. But in my opinion, not nearly enough. Fundamentally, we must also pay tribute to and honor the memories of cultures. And India carries a memory of great antiquity and great age. And that memory is carried through almost all of the ancient literature of India, and in every case, that memory involves a global cataclysm. It involves a flood. It involves a sudden rise in sea levels, and I think that begins to point us again towards the Ice Age.
Very interesting. It's a given for somebody like me growing up, imagining time to be cyclical, imagining that there is a sudden end to time.
Yeah.
I have a memory of this cave I visited in the mountains up in India. I was a little boy. In this cave, you had to descend backwards down an incline for about 100 feet before you arrived at this huge football-sized cave inside,
right.
with a bunch of things and a lot of things that are tied into the mythological aspect. So there's an ice shelf, this water trickling down that's frozen into ice that looks like the hair of Shiva.
Yeah.
And then there is this spot I remember very specifically where there's water dripping from the top and it's falling on this sole lone rock upon which there are small mounds of rock, and 3 mounds are the same height, and the next one is this tiny mound on which the water is dripping now.
Right.
And they say that this is it's a clock of the yugas, that the 3 last yugas are complete and the 4th one is slowly building up for completion. And so the way it's built into the cultural memory of Indians, a lot of what you say is very accessible. We're not as defensive about it.
No, exactly.
Right. The idea that there is a cataclysm is some of the early stories we hear.
Yeah.
Having said that, I know it's very difficult to sort of put a start date to it, but it's a broad claim. It's a tall claim. It's a heterodox claim in a certain way.
Yeah.
How would we imagine how long this might be? Is it 50,000 years or is it closer to 15,000 years?
As I said a moment ago, the only way to put bookends on this is you have to start somewhere. And the place that I start is, when did anatomically modern humans appear on this planet? It doesn't have to be that place, because we now know that there were other species of humans who were human, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, who go back much further. And when I say they were human, I say so advisedly, because we know from genetics that there was interbreeding between anatomically modern humans and Neanderthals. So in a way, the separation of anatomically modern humans from Neanderthals and Denisovans is a little bit artificial. We were all one species, actually, but we just looked very looked very different. Once you take the Denisovans and the Neanderthals into account, you can push that horizon back to 800,000 years, maybe even to 1 million years in the past, where creatures who very likely thought and functioned in much the same way that we do existed and lived on the planet. So I prefer to enclose my inquiry, my quest, within the last 300,000 years. But I have no objection to the possibility that it's older. But then we cannot ignore science completely. And there were Neanderthals, there were Denisovans, there were these cousin species. it used to be an insult to call somebody a Neanderthal. But we're now realizing that actually these were sensitive, intelligent creatures, that they did art. It's possible that they were the first artists, that they taught anatomically modern humans how to do art. So once we take into account the diversity of the human species and the fact that there were cousin species with which anatomically modern humans could breed, we could push this whole thing back hundreds of thousands of years further. But my preference, because otherwise the whole inquiry just sprawls all over time and all over the world, my preference has been to look at the last 300,000 years. And in those last 300,000 years, you have a strong academic view about what happens, about how things evolve. And our ancestors are supposed to have been entirely hunter-gatherers, hunter-foragers, right through 100,000 years ago, right through 26,000 years ago. There were some early attempts at preferring certain wild grasses that produced grains, but not cultivating them, not deliberately growing them, which you can date back to about 26,000 years ago. But it's not until 14,000 years ago, according to the mainstream academic record, that you start seeing the first traces, the first hints of agriculture. And I think that there's two issues here. The first issue is, how do we define a civilization? Must it have agriculture? Must it have cities? Or can it be a different kind of thing altogether? This is where I think that the yogic traditions of India are extremely important. We have a tendency, talking about any idea of a lost civilization, and my critics constantly fire this at me, that I'm talking about a highly advanced lost civilization that had spaceships and motor cars and stuff. No, I'm not. I'm not talking about that. I do not impose any idea on what this civilization was. I suspect that it was very, 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 very different from our own civilization, and that it is possible to have a civilization which can be defined as advanced, which is nurturing, which is caring, which is prosperous, which explores deep ideas. It's possible to have such a civilization without cities and without motor cars and without spaceships. We should not look for ourselves in the past. We should look for something very different. And I suspect that the kind of lost civilization that I'm talking about was much more along the yogic line of things than it was along the industrial technological production side of things. And it may well even have decided to avoid certain kinds of technology. But all of the myths and all of the traditions around the world, and this is not confined to India, it's everywhere, suggest that something went wrong. Something went wrong with that fundamental, that ancient civilization, and it became more materialistic, and it began to plunge into matter and to relish material things, and eventually the human species becomes so corrupt that the gods send a cataclysm to pretty much wipe us from the face of the earth. And it's very interesting, the story of Manu, which we find in the Mahabharata and in other texts from India. We have a yogic figure. He is approached by, he rescues a fish, and he puts it initially in a small container, but it keeps growing, and he puts it in a larger container. And then we learn that is actually, if I recall correctly, Krishna in the form of Vishnu.
Yes.
It's Vishnu in the form of a fish. And he's come to warn Manu that a cataclysm, that the pralaya is coming, and that he must build a survival ship. And in that survival ship, there is Manu and also the 7 sages, the seven rishis who are a part of this. Now, it's fascinating to me that this concept of the 7 sages is not confined to India. We find that concept in ancient Mesopotamia. The ancient Sumerian civilization, about 5,000, 6,000 years old, according to Orthodox dating, had a recollection of beings who came from the sea. They called them the Apkallu, the magicians of the gods, and taught civilization after a flood to the survivors of the flood. We have 7 sages in Egypt. We have 7 sages in Easter Island. This seems to be a global a global theme. But it's worked out in particular detail in India. Of course, the story of Manu is not so different from the story of Noah in the Hebrew Bible. There's the flood survivor whose responsibility is to bring mankind back from the brink. In the case of the Sumerians, the flood survivor is called Utnapishtim, and he is instructed to build a boat, a survival ship, to save the seeds of mankind. And for that, he's rewarded with immortal life by the gods. That he did a very great thing, that it saved humanity. Usually when the gods decide to wipe out humanity, there's one or two of them who regret it, and humanity is saved. If I were to look for a single resource which includes all the vital information on this memory of our past, and I do believe it's a memory, India would be the place to go. It's there in the most detail. It's across such a wide range of sources. It's very clear that India was the heart of this matter.
I had a very interesting guest who is a mythologist on my show a long time ago, and he'd mentioned something very interesting about the story of Manu, about how he's bathing in the river and a small fish comes, which is being chased by a large fish. Yeah. And Manu rescues the small fish in his palm. So the big fish complains to Manu, says, "You can't take away my food. This is against the laws of nature."
Yeah.
And Manu decides that whether it is against the laws of nature, it is for the laws of morality that must be done. Yeah. And he explained to me, it's almost like the birth of human consciousness written in a story format.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because even as an aphorism, even as a compartmentalization of thinking about ancient Indian civilization and modern civilizations, for us Indians, we think of the ancients having gone deeper within themselves and the moderns having gone further outside in the material world.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's absolutely the case. The modern world has become so clever, so cunning, and so shallow at the same time. We've in the modern world largely severed our connection with spirit, which is why the situation is so crazy and chaotic and dangerous in the world today. I mean, with nuclear weapons, human beings have actually equipped themselves with the power of gods.
Right.
And that power of gods is in the hands of individuals who have no maturity, no wisdom, who behave like crazed teenagers. They're the ones with their fingers on the nuclear button. If we cannot evolve, and when I say we, I mean the whole human race right now, if we cannot evolve our consciousness further, if we stay stuck in this low consciousness mode that dominates the world today, we're going to face another cataclysm. It's going to happen. Maybe it's going to be random nature. Maybe it's going to be something we do to ourselves through the folly of war. But we are a species which is not safe and is not secure. And all our technology does not make us safe and secure. It makes us less safe and less secure. And this is an area where we, I think, need to learn some of the lessons of the past and listen to the ancient mythologies, and to understand that we are part of a continuous process of rebirth and renewal. And involved in rebirth is the death of the old. That's what happens, and it may be that that's what our civilization is. It won't be the end of humanity. We will continue, but we will come back in a different form. When I look at the world today, and I consider the possibility of a global cataclysm, however caused, it's very clear to me that those who would survive the cataclysm would be the meek of the earth. They would be the humble people. It would be the people who still have hunting and gathering skills. It would be the people who are capable of living off the land. All of the urban dwellers with their highly specialized knowledge of a particular bit of technology, useless, completely useless for survival. That's why I would say that our civilization is extremely fragile, and it looks like the lost civilizations that mythology speak of in the past. So I think time has come when we need to be very, very careful. One point I'd like to mention, we talked about the Indus Valley civilization. And the Indus Valley civilization, broadly speaking, these are round numbers, about 4,500 to 5,000 years old, according to official chronology. it's really interesting that in that same window, and let's expand that window a little bit. Let's expand it to 6,000 years. We even said if you go to Mehrgar, which is a predecessor of the Indus Valley civilization, that's 7,000 years old. We don't have to keep it at 4.5. It's more of a window, really. And we could say that that window is roughly sort of 6 to 4,000 years ago. And the fascinating thing is that in ancient Egypt, in ancient Sumer, Mesopotamia, in ancient India, the Indus Valley civilization, in ancient China, the Yellow River civilization, and right across the Pacific Ocean in ancient Peru, the Caral Supe civilization, they all pop up in that same window. All of them at the same time, and with much shared iconography and shared ideas, and all with memories of a flood and of sages who bring them wisdom. And I can't help speculating that that is not random, that there's something going on, that it's a memory of the lost civilization, that there were survivors, that those survivors did pass down knowledge through time. Perhaps they formed themselves into secret societies of some kind. And that I think actually that what we're seeing as the beginning of civilization was actually a reboot of civilization. It was something that was done deliberately with planning, and it all happened in that particular window between 6,000 and 4,000 years ago. And what it goes back to is a much earlier civilization that understood what happened and what needed to be done. And it's fascinating the way that these civilizations all around the world all appear at the same time and all have essentially the same growth progress.
Let me state the broader claim that's part of your work for people that may not completely know. The idea is that civilizations older than what modern history tells us, that there is a large cataclysmic, what Indians understand as pralay, a large disaster of sorts, a natural disaster, probably of the nature of floods.
Yeah.
About 13,000, 12,800 to 13,000.
Yeah, to be clear on that point, I have focused for actually many years now on an episode of anomalous radical climate change called the Younger Dryas. That's Dryas. It's actually a species of alpine flower that flourishes in extremely cold conditions. And if you look at the climate chart for the last ice age, we have fairly good idea how the climate unfolded during the last ice age. There's a lot of solid evidence that gives clues on this. If we look at the climate chart, the ice age reaches its maximum extent. It's called the last glacial maximum, around 21,000 years ago. That's the moment when sea level is fully 120 meters lower than it is today. And then gradually, not suddenly, not cataclysmically, but gradually the world begins to warm up and it becomes more comfortable. And areas that would have been uninhabitable before become more inhabitable. And this continues right through until 14,000 years ago. The warming at that point is called meltwater pulse 1A. We do see a significant rise in sea level, as we would expect, with the world getting warmer. So it all looks really good. It looks like the world is heading to a really nice place after hundreds of thousands of years of freezing conditions all over the northern hemisphere at any rate. And then suddenly, 12,800 years ago, it goes into reverse. And it's really sudden. It's a 10-year period. It's not a 500-year period. In 10 years, the global climate reverses from warm and comfortable to utterly freezing again, as cold as it was at the peak of the last ice age. And anomalously, at that very moment that the world plunges into this deep freeze, there's a sudden spike of sea level rise, 12,800 years ago. A lot of authorities don't recognize this, but it's very thoroughly documented. And you have to ask yourself, how could that happen? How could sea level suddenly rise at a time when the world is getting extremely cold and it should be frozen on the ice caps? And that's why I prefer, as an explanation for the Younger Dryas, what is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which is the suggestion that a large comet from deep space entered the solar system about 20,000 years ago. And it went into an orbit that crosses the orbit of the Earth, an orbit around the sun. And then it began to do what all comets do when they are subjected to gravitational forces. They break up into multiple pieces. And the calculations are that this comet originally may have been as much as 100 kilometers in diameter. And by the way, this is not me just speaking off the top of my head. This is the solid science. A group of really solid mainstream scientists are behind the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And what they point out is that with this fragmentation of a very large comet, instead of having one object that you need to avoid, you suddenly have hundreds of thousands of objects. And those objects may be very large. We know what the downstream effect of this disintegrating comet is because we still pass through it twice a year. It's called the torrid meteor stream. We pass through it at the end of June, and we pass through it in October, November. And it takes about 12 days to pass through it because the torrid meteor stream is now 30 million kilometers wide. And that is all the fragmentation, the disintegration of what was once a single large comet. Now we have a 30 million kilometer wide debris stream through which the Earth passes twice a year. And we know from studies of the torrid meteor stream that there's big objects up there. There's objects that are, the comet Enki is one of the original fragments of the original comet. It's six kilometers in diameter. You smack into a 6 kilometer in diameter object and all civilization is over on this planet immediately. But there's actually hundreds of objects of that size. So the suggestion, to cut a long story short, is that 12,800 years ago, as this comet was fragmenting and its debris stream was getting wider, that the Earth plowed through a particularly lumpy bit of the debris stream, and that over a period of relatively short period, the Earth was pounded, not with massive impacts of the kind that wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, a 10-kilometer wide object. No, largely with air bursts of smaller bits of the comet. But those air bursts are themselves equivalent to a nuclear explosion. And you're looking at hundreds of them all over the world. And the science is suggesting that it was that encounter with a swarm of debris from a disintegrated comet that plunged the Earth into the Younger Dryas. That's why the sea level rose, because the heat of the impact and the shock of those objects on an ice sheet would have definitely melted parts of the ice sheet. That's the suggestion. But there are other possibilities. It could have been radical solar activity, which was involved in this in some way. We just don't know for sure. But what we do know for sure is that the Younger Dryas climate anomaly did happen. That 12,800 years ago, the world went out of a warming phase into a sudden freezing phase. That lasted for 1,200 years until 11,600 years ago. And then again, there's a radical warming that follows that. So we have to take account in the relatively recent part of the human story of a major global cataclysm that took place. And we have a name for that cataclysm. We call it the Younger Dryas. We are not sure exactly why it happened, but nobody's in any dispute that it did happen. And during that period between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, we also witnessed the almost complete extinction of all of the megafauna of the Ice Age, the woolly rhinos, the mammoths, the mastodons, the giant sloths. Horses in North America also went extinct at that time. It was clearly a massive event, and there's evidence that it affected human populations as well. I think that is my best bet for when we lost this chapter in the human story, that it was between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. And there's clear evidence, places like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, of some kind of effort being made to restore, to return. The Göbekli Tepe is very anomalous. There's this huge megalithic site in Turkey, which is 11,600 years old, which is exactly the time of that second sea level rise. Then everything seems to go not quiet, but we enter what archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution. I don't think it was a Neolithic revolution. I think ideas were carried down from the past. I think there was a lost civilization. It was very different from our own. It had mastered certain sciences, including astronomy. I believe it had explored the Earth. And I say that because certain ancient maps have survived. Usually they're copies of older source maps that are now lost, which incorporate very precise relative longitudes. And when you have relative longitudes on a map that was drawn in the 15th century, where the map maker tells us that he copied it from a much older map, you have to begin to ask yourself, what's going on here? Because our so-called technologically advanced civilization didn't crack the longitude problem until the middle of the 18th century. And here we find the longitude problem cracked on old maps. And sometimes those maps show the world as it looked during the last ice age. So I think we have a lot of work to do on the ice age and on unearthing a lost part of the human story.
And so to finish the idea I was painting out, something happens during 12,800 and 11,600
Yes.
that wipes out existing civilization in a way that we are only left with small fragments of cultural memory with which we rebuild civilization.
Yeah.
That's the claim. And
That's the claim.
Right.
And I don't think that it was that this civilization was just based in one place. I think it was in more than one place. There was a maritime, seagoing civilization, not with big iron and metal ships, but with relatively simple ships that were nonetheless capable of exploring the world. It may be there are quite a number of ancient cultures which look back on a golden age and then look at the intervention of the gods and things go wrong and humanity is wiped out. The story of Atlantis produces a lot of scorn and mockery from academics, although the source, Plato, is really excellent, and he based himself on Solon. We understand from that story, which should not be separated from the global tradition of a flood, where India is certainly the best example. The story of Atlantis should not be separated. It is part of the worldwide flood tradition, and it has many things in common with the worldwide flood tradition. And one of those things it has in common is the notion that corruption enters into a civilization, that it is going in a certain direction, that it is beautiful, that it is nurturing, that it is everything that you would want a human civilization to be, but slowly, the worm of corruption enters in, and it becomes materialistic, it becomes cruel, it begins to impose its power around the world. And as a consequence of that, the disaster occurs, attributed to the gods, to the intervention of the gods, which bring that civilization down.
right.
And it just may be the case that following the cataclysms of the Younger Dryas, the lost civilization I'm thinking of was not completely destroyed, not completely, but it made a moral decision. It made a decision that it could not continue on the path that it was continuing on, that something had gone seriously wrong, that the marriage of heaven and earth had broken, and that it should continue in a different way. And that's why I think the survivors took their time and passed on knowledge slowly, bit by bit, to many cultures around the world. And that, to cut a long story short, is why I think those 5 big river valley civilizations, Egypt,
Mesopotamia.
Sumer, Indus Valley Civilization, Yellow River Civilization in China, and the Corral Civilization in Peru. That's why I think they all popped up at the same time. Because they're the result of a project, which we can trace back to the survivors of a lost civilization, which felt such guilt and horror about the direction in which it had gone, that it blamed itself for what had happened, and that it pulled back and made itself as invisible as possible until the right time.
Right. And so effectively, and these are your words, that humanity is a civilization. Humanity has civilizational amnesia?
A species with amnesia.
Species with
and
amnesia.
to be fair on Immanuel Velikovsky, not entirely my words.
Sure.
Because Velikovsky wrote a book called Mankind in Amnesia. There's no doubt that when I use the phrase species with amnesia, I'm inspired by Velikovsky, who was very interested in the phenomenon of global cataclysms.
Right.
By the way. But I think we are. I think we are a species with amnesia. And I think that we demonstrate many of the characteristics of amnesia, which is a refusal to get to grips with our own circumstances, a refusal to recognize what we are doing to ourselves, an absolute blanket denial that we see from archaeologists that they could have made any serious mistakes in the understanding of the past. I mean, to me, it is most unfortunate that a small group of academics with a very rigid and fixed idea of what the past should look like are those who are entrusted with interpreting the past to the rest of humanity. We shouldn't do that. Yes, archaeology does some very good things, some very useful things. It should be part of our toolkit in understanding the past, but it should not be the only toolkit. And that's one of the big problems with archaeology.
Right. With archaeology, with paleontology, one of the issues is that you cannot recover all the evidence, and so you cannot tie the story together.
You can't, and
you'll never find it.
This is the problem, and it's why. If there were not 1,000 other reasons to suspect that we're missing a chapter from the human story, I would be less interested in the areas of the world that archaeologists don't look at. But there is so much evidence. There is so much evidence, whether it's the ancient knowledge of astronomy, whether it's the ancient maps, whether it's the incredible construction techniques that confront us from the remote past, which we cannot understand, and we can't do them today. There's a huge amount of evidence that we are missing something from our story. And then it becomes legitimate to ask, where actually do archaeologists look? Do they look in the Sahara Desert, which was green and fertile during the Ice Age? Well, frankly, no, not very much. There's been a little bit of archaeology, usually surface surveys in tiny parts of the 9 million square kilometers of the Sahara Desert. Do they look at the 27 million square kilometers flooded coastal margins at the end of the Ice Age? That's the size of Europe and China added together. No, by and large, they don't look at that. They might look at shipwrecks. There might be a little bit of marine archaeology, but you're just scratching the surface. Do they look at the Amazon rainforest?
Right. That's a huge place.
A vast area where new information is now coming out, which shows us that we've completely misunderstood and misinterpreted the Amazon, and that the Amazon is in fact a man-made creation. It's a garden created by human beings.
Really?
Oh, absolutely.
What's the information?
Well, the information is the hyperdominance of certain species of trees. For example, the Brazil nut tree. These species of trees should be in the same level of representation as all other trees. But it turns out that tree species that serve human needs, that provide food for human beings, are hyperdominant in the Amazon. They are massively overrepresented, which leaves us with only one conclusion: that human beings deliberately engineered the Amazon to turn it into this resource that it is today. We now know that there were populations of millions in the Amazon, that they had an advanced form of soil management, which allowed crops to grow in the Amazon, which otherwise normally wouldn't grow in a rainforest. We're just beginning. And still today, despite the tragedy of the clearances of Amazon rainforest for very short-term, stupid reasons, despite that, we still have 5 million square kilometers that are under dense canopy rainforest. And new research, which I've been involved in, involving LiDAR, is revealing massive structures under that canopy. And this is just the beginning of the story. So my point is, there is much to invite us to consider the possibility of a major forgotten episode in human civilization. Right. And unfortunately, those who are entrusted with interpreting our past to us, archaeologists, haven't done enough work. They've only scratched the surface of large parts of the world that were very attractive places to live during the Ice Age. The Sahara Desert was a very attractive place to live. It was green, it was fertile, it was full of rivers and lakes, until about 6,000 years ago, actually. The coastal margins, as I said earlier, were the best real estate on Earth during the Ice Age. And these are precisely the areas that archaeology isn't looking at enough. I'm sorry, archaeologists, but it's not good enough to go and look at some wall in Britain and say there was no lost civilization. Do the work, go underwater, explore those 27 million square kilometers that were flooded at the end of the Ice Age, really explore the Sahara Desert, really explore the Amazon, and then come back and tell me there was no lost civilization. But until you've done that work, I'm afraid you're not in a position to do that. So I have many argumentative and difficult encounters with archaeologists, and I wish it wasn't so. I wish it could be more constructive. I wish archaeologists would stop treating themselves as some kind of science on a par with neuroscience, because it's not a science. It's an interpretive discipline with very flimsy, limited numbers of facts on which interpretations must be put. And that being the case, we need to bring many different skills to bear. We absolutely got to listen to the mythology of ancient cultures. We got to look in depth at the mythology of ancient India. And the huge story it tells about humanity, which is very much not the story that modern science is telling. Why should we think that modern science has got it right all the time? Modern science is like a little pimple on the forehead of an adolescent. When you take it in context of human knowledge and human achievement over hundreds of thousands of years, modern science is just yesterday. It's not in a position yet to say we know everything, and it's particularly not in a position to say we know everything about the human past, because we don't. And if we want to know more, the first place we should go is a culture like India, which retains deep, deep memories and detailed memories of that past.
It is very interesting to think of the fact that most of the surface area of this planet that we live on is underexplored. Whether that is the Sahara, the Amazon.
Yeah.
You can think of the Himalayas as being one of those places.
Absolutely, yes.
And then the waterbed. Like, it's completely unexplored as to what lies in the waterbed as a whole. We don't have a great idea about marine life in deep oceans. That's in the same way. And when we know parallelly in the evolution track, there are so many large holes that we cannot fill with fossil evidence.
Absolutely.
Why would we be shy of admitting that might be the case with history?
Yeah.
And I think to discard mythology as pure story making is such a cheap endeavor.
I agree with you. It's just a cheap out,
right?
Which doesn't get to grips with the reality that actually these so-called myths, these traditions, these scriptures, they are the only memory we have of the time before this current manifestation of humanity began to write things down. I mean, that if we say what is history, history as defined is the period for which there are written documents.
Right.
And we have only got written documents, so far as we know, going back 6,000 years. But we have memories of the time before that. Those memories are passed down in oral traditions.
Right.
Oral traditions, it's very well established, are excellent at preserving information. This is, it's one of the things that actually got me on to this investigation into the possibility of a lost civilization. And I want to pay tribute to two historians of science, professors of the history of science. Giorgio de Santillana, who was professor of the history of science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Hertha von Deschent, who was professor of the history of science at Frankfurt University. And it was they who first picked up in ancient mythology all around the world the evidence that this phenomenon I mentioned earlier, the precession of the equinoxes, was known about much earlier than the Greeks, thousands of years earlier, tens of thousands of years earlier. And they pointed out that once you embed information in a good story, the next storyteller doesn't even have to know that information is there. All they have to do is tell the story true. And if it's a great story that really touches the human heart, people will keep on telling that story for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And maybe there may be a long period during the retelling of that story when nobody gets it. They don't get the information that's hidden in it, which testifies to a highly advanced knowledge of astronomy. But then a time will come when somebody will get it. They will see the patterns. In the case of precession of the equinoxes in ancient mythology, it's tied up with a number of different devices. The first of all is the heartbeat of the cycle, 1 degree every 72 years. If the number is divisible by 72 or involved in 72 in any way, you have to be suspicious about it. Like the number 108.
Such an interesting number.
Yes.
Why is 108 interesting to you?
It's 72 plus 36. It's 72 plus half of 72. It is a number. Again, we don't have time to go into this, but the legwork was done by Santillana and von Deschen back in the 1960s in their book Hamlet's Mill. These numbers are encoded in mythology all around the world. That's why 108 is very familiar to you.
Yes.
They're encoded all around the world, but not only numbers. Also encoded is an image of something whirling and turning. In the case of India, it's the churning of the Milky Ocean.
Wow.
The churning of the Milky Ocean with the great serpent
Great
wrapped
serpent,
around
yes.
Mount Mandara. And gods on one side and demons on the other, and they're pulling and they're churning the Milky Ocean, and that is going to produce Amrita, the elixir of immortality.
Right.
That particular image in Egypt is Horus and Set, opposing deities, turning a fire drill. In Danish mythology, it's Hamlet's mill. It's this great mill that churns and whirls in the ocean. Always the image is accompanied with the numbers. And it's very clear, once you look at this in depth, that a concerted effort was made to pass down scientific knowledge in myth. And those who made that effort knew that the most enduring way to pass down knowledge is not in a written document. A written document is actually a pretty useless way to pass down knowledge to the future. Why? Because in 10,000 years' time, you cannot be sure that anybody will be able to read your script, just like we can't read the Indus Valley script today. There are so many scripts that can't be read, the Easter Island script, for example, and many others. So to entrust crucial information, which will tell those in the future something about you and what you knew, to entrust that to a written document would be a serious mistake, because you can be pretty sure that nobody's ever going to be able to read that document. What you want to do is entrust it to a vehicle that is almost immortal, and good stories are almost immortal. They will, just by human nature alone, they will be passed on from generation to generation to generation, and eventually a time will come when somebody gets it and sees what that story is concealing.
I think...
Just to finish on oral traditions.
Yes, please.
The work that's been done, for example, recently in Australia, makes it clear that oral traditions can preserve extremely accurate memories going back more than 10,000 years. They're capable, and far more than any written tradition, they're capable of preserving those memories, remembering a particular landscape that was above water and is now underwater. Those memories passed on in oral tradition testify to the strength of oral traditions, that they are reliable sources. And this is another mistake that archaeology makes, is that they ignore these traditions. They think it's just all fantasy and the ancients were just making stuff up to have a bit of fun. No, they weren't making stuff up to have a bit of fun. These were serious, dedicated people who were passing information down to the future.
It's very interesting because the Vedic tradition originates as an oral tradition, right?
Yeah.
A lot of the stuff written in the Vedas is written in a hymn format, in a lyrical format where it rhymes so that it's easier to remember.
Easy to remember,
and it gets easy. And if this was just fantasy and myth and unimportant and just passing time while I'm sitting by the fire, I won't care to make it into poetry and then compile them. And then teach it to a student from a teacher. There's sacredness to a teacher teaching something to a student. Yeah. It's also very interesting because if I remember correctly, I'm supposed, in my tradition, I'm supposed to chant a mantra 108 times.
Yep.
The number of beads on is 108. And when you said 108, it just sparked something in me because it's so private to my imagination, to my audience's imagination, what 108 means. The Surya Namaskar, for instance, if I'm not incorrect, is supposed to be done 108 times, which is a sun salutation.
Let me give you another example, which is in Cambodia. In Angkor, on the bridge that goes to Angkor Thom, they have in 3 dimensions an image of the churning of the Milky Ocean there. It's not a relief carved on a wall. They're actual figures holding the serpent. Well, on each side of the bridge, there's 54 figures. 54 times 2 is 108.
Wow.
That number.
That's not a coincidence.
It's not a coincidence.
Right.
It's not a coincidence. And in the case of Angkor, it is tied up directly with that imagery of a churning, whirling thing, which calls to mind the unbalanced nature of the Earth's rotation. So the Earth is rotating on its own axis once every day, but the extended North Pole of the Earth is engaged in this very, very, very slow, there's a wobble on the axis of the Earth. And that is what produces the observable of precession of the equinoxes. And it's fascinating to me that the ancients went to such lengths to incorporate knowledge of precession in their stories and to pass them down to the future. They obviously felt it was very important in two ways. First of all, it tells us something about them, that these were serious people who had studied astronomy very deeply. And secondly, it may carry a warning that connected to precession are phenomena that can affect human life on Earth. And actually that's true, because one of the factors that drives ice ages is precisely the precession of the equinoxes. There's this wobble on the axis of the Earth.
It's very interesting. If I even think about archaeology and sort of the evidence making, and this is how a large part of the people I come from think about it. My dad often says, it's like, until they explain to me how they got the pyramids right, I'm not going to listen to them anything on conclusions on how old my civilization is. Yeah. It's a shortcut to thinking. It's a
fair point, intuition. Though. It's a fair point. Once there are certain structures from the past. Most striking in India is the Kailash Nath Temple. I mean,
what is happening there? Right?
I've been there. It is a most extraordinary thing. I mean, carved out of solid rock. This gigantic temple, and it's perfect, you know. I'm not sure we could do that today, and even if we could do it, we wouldn't have the motivation or the will to do it. There's a huge will and drive behind the creation of something like the Kailash Nath Temple, and then of course the pyramids of Egypt, particularly the Great Pyramid, they defy understanding. I would say of all ancient monuments in the world, the one that I know best is the Great Pyramid of Egypt. I've been in every known chamber inside the Great Pyramid. I've climbed the Great Pyramid 5 times. I know that monument like the back of my hand, and I can't explain anything about it. It is all a mystery. The fact, here's those numbers again. The Great Pyramid incorporates the dimensions of the Earth on a scale of 1 to 43,200. 43,200, remember the number of those numbers? 432,000 years in the Kali Yuga. 43,200 is one of those precessional numbers. So here you have a monument that weighs 6 million tons, that is situated pretty much exactly on latitude 30 north. That means it's 1/3 of the way between the equator and the North Pole. It's not a random location, it's a chosen location. It is almost perfectly aligned to true north. Within, the right figure to quote is 3/60ths of a single degree, because each degree is divided into 60 minutes. So it's 3 minutes of arc. It's a slight error, but it's almost perfect. So it's a monument that is speaking to the Earth. It is situated at a significant latitude. Okay, and it is oriented with uncanny precision for a monument with a 13-acre footprint to true north. It is speaking to our planet. And then we find that if you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you get an exact readout of the polar radius of the Earth. And if you measure the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid and multiply that by 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. So on a scale defined by a key motion of the Earth itself, the precession of its axis, on such a scale, the Great Pyramid is giving us the dimensions of the Earth. It can't be an accident. There's too many bits and pieces. Could it accidentally have got almost perfectly aligned to true north? Maybe. Could it accidentally have ended up on latitude 30? Maybe. But could it incorporate the dimensions on the Earth on a scale of 1 to 43,200, which is a scale devised from a key motion of the Earth itself, the wobble of the Earth's axis that we call precession? That can't be a coincidence. That is deliberate planning. And so we are looking at the consequences of great minds at work who had a profound understanding of the cosmos, of the solar system, of the dimensions of the Earth, and in addition, who were able to build at an almost supernatural scale involving very, very, very large blocks of stone. Above the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid, there are blocks that weigh more than 70 tons. These blocks are more than 200 feet above ground level. Nobody can understand how they got up there, how that was done. Egyptologists come up with these lame explanations and say, oh, they must have used ramps. Well, I'm sorry, if you're going to have a ramp that anybody can actually tow a 70-ton block up, it's going to have to be a really long ramp with a gradual degree of slope. You can't have a slope like that. It's got to slope out far into the desert. There's no remnant of any such ramps, and the ramps couldn't have been built of sand. They had to have been built of solid stone to carry the weight of those heavy stones. So again and again, the Great Pyramid confronts us with mysteries that we cannot explain. We can dodge them, we can go around them, we can say, oh, we understand, but we don't. We don't understand it. It's a huge question mark sitting there on the Giza Plateau, requiring us, and what it's requiring us to do is to think for ourselves and ask questions, which is precisely what archaeologists don't want us to do when it comes to the past.
When we date something like that, do we get any dating figures from?
Yes, the standard method of dating in archaeology, of course, is the famous carbon dating.
Yes.
And there are some anomalies, there are some puzzles in carbon dating from the Great Pyramid. For example, in the Queen's Chamber, so-called Queen's Chamber, none of the names that are given to any of the chambers in the Great Pyramid have anything to do with the pyramid builders. They're all stuff that was put there by Egyptologists later on. In the Queen's Chamber, there are two shafts in the wall. These shafts are this high and this wide. They weren't even visible until 1872 because the final stone over the entrance to the shaft was closed. But an enterprising explorer found them by finding hollow areas in the wall, broke through and found he's entering a shaft which goes horizontally about this far and then rises up at an angle. In the northern shaft of the Queen's Chamber, remember, it was completely sealed until 1872, and it does not exit on the outside of the Great Pyramid. In the northern shaft of the Queen's Chamber was found a piece of wood, ideal for carbon dating. It was there. It was like a rod of wood, and actually a metal hook and a stone ball was found in there as well. But you can carbon date the rod. And it turns out that the rod of wood is about 500 years older than the date supposedly given for the Great Pyramid. Now, Egyptologists normally would say, oh, the carbon date, we accept carbon dating. But because the carbon dating contradicts their date for the Great Pyramid, they say, oh, they must have used old wood. What a devious way to explain a serious problem. There is a serious problem with the carbon dating of the Great Pyramid. It doesn't make it thousands of years older, but it makes it 500 years older than it's supposed to be. And then I think what has to be understood, and I think this would be true with the Kailash Nath Temple as well, is you're not necessarily looking at a project that was completed in one generation. You're looking at a project that may have taken hundreds or thousands of years to complete. I think the Great Pyramid is a classic multi-generational problem. I think what happened at Giza 4,500 years ago was the completion of a project that's thousands and thousands of years older. And that's why parts of it do relate to that period and parts of it don't.
The mystery with the Kailash Temple is we don't know where the rock went. So all the rock that's taken out of the...
Where did it go?
Where did it go?
I know.
And no amount of effort. I mean, if I was a builder of temples and if I've successfully built a monument of the same rock, I'm not going to carry tons of rocks so much further away that it can't be traced.
You can't ever find them. Yeah.
Right. So it seems like it was vaporized or something because otherwise it just doesn't make sense.
That's right. And that's why it is precisely because archaeology is not providing satisfactory answers to such problems that we must begin to speculate. And we must begin to wonder what actually was going on. Did they have some kind of technology that we don't understand? That's a reasonable question to ask when confronted by a mystery like that.
Right.
Especially when those who are supposed to be answering that question don't answer it. They just dismiss it as a non-problem. And they say, of course, it was easy to do. No, it was not easy to do. And it's the same is true for the gigantic megalithic constructions in South America as well. Archaeology hands most of them over to the Incas. But the Incas themselves didn't say that. They said they inherited these structures from earlier times. I think we need to be much more open to listening to the authentic voices of the past than we are at present.
So there is these interesting megalithic monuments. There's the Göbekli Tepe. There is stuff you found in Indonesia, if I remember correctly from your show. There was this very interesting pyramid-looking mountain that if you dig under.
Gunung Padang.
Right, Gunung Padang, right? There is the Kailash Nath Temple. There is famously the Egyptian pyramids. There is a horde of pyramids in Mexico, for instance, that can't even be uncovered because it's surrounded by so much forest, and we don't know what that is or what that means at all.
Yeah, we don't know
what the purpose and why does pyramid as a structure, because it's an unobvious structure. In all fairness, it's not the facade that I would build for my home or for my temple.
No,
but these pyramids are everywhere, and there's too many coincidences.
And you know what? They're not only everywhere, but I would say it's true that everywhere you go, if you get into the culture, you will find that the pyramid is connected in some way to the mystery of death and the afterlife. This it's very clear in the case of ancient Egypt that whatever else they were doing with the pyramids, one of the things that they were doing was ensuring the afterlife that the individual sought. And the pyramids seem to have been part of an initiation project. The ancient Egyptians had very clear ideas of what happens when we die. And what happens when we die in the ancient Egyptian system is that we enter an underworld. And that underworld is filled with things that look like the Great Pyramid. It's filled with sloping corridors. And you can see images of it painted on the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. They call it the Duat, the underworld. Looks just like the pyramids, the interior of the pyramids. And then you are confronted with a moment where you have to weigh up your life. It's called the weighing of the soul. It's very graphic, simple image, which shows a scale. And in the scale, in one pan of the scale, is the soul of the deceased, represented as his or her heart. And in the other is a feather. And that is the feather of the goddess Maat, who represents truth and justice and cosmic harmony. A lot of people say that the ancient Egyptians were obsessed with death. I would actually say they were obsessed with life. How do we live our lives? What is the way to live a life to ensure that our heart is not heavy in the scales against the feather? We must end our lives with balance. Actually, at the heart of it is a very sophisticated set of ideas about how we should live. And somehow, for some reason, in the imagery of the underworld, pyramids constantly figure. And the pyramid, in a way, was seen as a kind of reincarnation device by the ancient Egyptians. And I'm not one to say that they were wrong. I have had the opportunity to be alone in the heart of the Great Pyramid. It's a very different experience from when you're there with 20 or 30 other people. If you're there completely alone, in silence, you suddenly realize that you're surrounded by something that is sentient, something that is intelligent, something that begins to come out of the walls and start to communicate with you. This is where all the archaeologists say Hancock is a complete lunatic. He's talking to pyramids. I would say to those archaeologists, try it, actually. Just try that silence and see what goes on. This is a communication device. And it is from our past, through our present, to our future. And it lasts forever, you know. Nobody's ever going to get rid of the Great Pyramid. It's or the Kailash Nath Temple, for that matter. These are permanent structures. It's going to. I mean, I guess you could get rid of them with the madness of our society today, but very hard to do so.
There is also the story of the Kailash mountain, Mount Kailash. Have you heard of that?
Yes, I have.
It's shaped like a pyramid.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, has three big, large faces to it too.
Yeah.
And you're not supposed to climb for religious reasons, so people don't really summit it. But people describe being around it as being part of a vibration that's very different from anywhere else.
Yeah.
And
I pick you up on that because I think that's another thing that we're making a mistake of in our society. We're not understanding that places have soul, that places have, that there are places of power on the earth, that the earth is surrounded by spots which are naturally sacred. And those of the ancients who were in tune with the earth would build temples and sacred structures on those points to magnify and elaborate their energy. And of course, again, the cynicism and the materialism of archaeology says that's complete nonsense. It's funny because archaeologists often present themselves as the defenders of indigenous cultures and indigenous beliefs, but actually they pour scorn on all of the ideas of the ancients concerning sacred places around the world, for example, on all of the ideas contained in mythology. We need to respect those ideas. They should be the first datum point for archaeology, not the last.
Modernity operates weirdly in that, and this is a perfect example, yoga, which literally translates into union, which is now known in the Western world as yoga, is seen as an exercise to stretch out fascia. Your muscles and your fascia stretched out, which was invented as a technique of consciousness to be in harmony.
Yeah.
That each of the pose has a solid spiritual backing to it.
Yeah.
And there is supposed to be a meditative or a reflective aspect to it beyond just the stretch. It's not downward dog. No. It's I don't think Indians take it offensively enough, where you've taken something so central to the Indian thought, the philosophy, the cultural imprint, and made it into an exercise. And I mean, it's not just the West that's done it. It's a certain Indian proponents that have done it. But it's reflective of modernity in that you've discounted everything underwater and everything that's part of the psyche.
Absolutely right.
And it seems like there is sense to be made of the fact that there are...
Look, yoga is a spiritual discipline.
Right.
That's the bottom line here. Yoga is a spiritual discipline. And the physical aspects of it are secondary. They're part of the means of entering a certain state of consciousness,
right,
which is necessary. One of the images I've talked about this once or twice before, but I find fascinating is the so-called Pasupati seal from the Indus Valley civilization, which shows a rather Shiva-like individual sitting in a very difficult yoga posture, which I believe is called Mula Bandhasana, which involves not just sitting. I'm so stiff.
Is it?
But it involves turning the feet backwards under the buttocks.
Huh.
It is extremely difficult to do. And we are seeing it in a seal that is 5,000 years old. We are seeing an advanced yoga posture in a 5,000-year-old document. That tells us that yoga is much older than the Indus Valley civilization, thousands and thousands of years older. This was already a fully evolved discipline by the time of the Indus Valley civilization.
Right.
And fundamentally a spiritual discipline. And that is the big difference between modern so-called civilizations and the ancients, as I mentioned earlier. And these were the words actually of a shaman in the Amazon. The problem with technological culture is that we have severed our connection with spirit. And we cannot do that. We are fundamentally spiritual beings. Mm-hmm. We can't just cut that off with a vast pair of scissors and say, well, we're just material creatures now, because that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Purely on the level of evidence also, if there is a script that's 4,500 years ago, this is the Harappan script, right? We don't have any sense of how this comes about. There is, I'm sure, scripts in other parts of these ancient civilizations that we just don't know. There are monuments, clearly, that we don't know of. That must not have been a 400-500 year adventure to come up with a language and then encode it.
Yes.
And then that language leads to civilization in a way. There is governance. Famously, there is drainage in the Harappan Indus civilization. For that thought to have evolved, if it's taken modern humans a few thousand years to get there, I just can't see that as like, 20 years later.
It took a long time.
So there has to be genesis before the evidence is captured.
Definitely.
Right.
You're absolutely right. And this is again what is missing. And it's again why we're a species with amnesia, because so much of our story isn't available to us. We've been cut off from
now you've dived off the coast.
I have. There was a period of my life. My wife Santha and I work very closely together. Santha is a photographer. I'm a writer, so we have complementary skills. And the two of us, for a book called Underworld that I published in 2002, for the 7 years prior to that, we were almost constantly scuba diving all over the world. And the the reason for that was the sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age, and the fact that there's 27 million square kilometers underwater today that wasn't underwater then. So what's actually down there? And I find myself very dissatisfied with the minimal work that archaeology has done. So we decided to do a bit of work ourselves, not with institutional financing, just on our own initiative. And that involved talking to local fishermen and local divers all around the world. In the case of Mamallapuram, I think they call it now.
The older name is Mahabali and now Mamallapuram.
Mamallapuram.
Right.
We just walked along the beach there and we started talking to fishermen. It happens that my wife Santha is of Tamil origin, so she can speak the Tamil language. And talking to these fishermen, we realized they had a huge story to tell. They were actually complaining to us that there was a city underwater off the coast of Mamallapuram.
They were saying it on their own accord.
On their own accord. We're just asking, have you come across anything odd or strange? And they said, yes, we have. There's a city down there. And actually, it's very annoying because we keep catching our nets on it. People have to go down and free dive. Sometimes people die loosening the net. And we took them seriously on this, organized an expedition with the National Institute of Oceanography, based in Goa, in India, and with the Scientific Exploration Society here in the UK. We went diving, and sure enough, everything those fishermen said was true. There is a city underwater off the coast of Mamallapuram, and this is one of the reasons that I don't fully trust archaeology, because this was more than 20 years ago. And I've seen this with my own eyes, and so did the archaeologists who were diving with us. To this day, they have not extended the exploration beyond what is called the intertidal zone. The intertidal zone is going down to a depth of about 5 meters maximum.
Wow.
And it's a high energy zone, which means that very little survives in it. You need to go out where we went, 2-3 kilometers out from shore. Then you're going to find, not at depths of 5 meters, but at depths of 30 meters plus, you're going to find the remnants of a city. Another place we dived was Pumpahar, also off the southeast coast of India. And that was not as a result of us talking to local fishermen. That was the National Institute of Oceanography itself. They had heard rumors of a structure underwater, and they took us there. And sure enough, there is a massive man-made U-shaped structure at a depth of 31 or 32 meters off the coast of. It means it's been submerged for more than 12,000 years. That's what 30 meters means. It's been underwater for at least 12,000 years. And then up in the northwest, we did not dive in the Gulf of Kambat, but there's been a detailed sonar survey that's been done in the Gulf of Kambat, which shows the regular contours of a man-made city underwater, again at 30 plus meters, even more, 40, 45 meters underwater in the Gulf of Kambat. And again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it's not been followed up. It's not been followed up. Side scan sonar is showing definite evidence of enormous man-made structures under the Gulf of Kambat, and we're not following it up. Dwarka is a more complicated problem. I've dived there. I'm not sure if they're diving in the right place. There is a city underwater at Dwarka, and I've dived on it, but it's quite shallow. It's 5 to 10 meters maximum. And I think that what in the area they're diving, what we may be looking at in Dwarka is rather similar to what we're looking at Cleopatra's Palace in Alexandria in the Mediterranean. There was a subsidence of land. It wasn't because of sea level rise. There was a land subsidence that submerged structures that aren't particularly old and put them underwater. I think the work in Dwarka needs to be extended much further out. If you look at it, it's possible to create maps which show us with a considerable level of detail how the world looked during the Ice Age. And those maps invite us to look further out in Dwarka, not so close to shore. Get further out. What we may be looking at close to shore is a later Dwarka. The earlier, the oldest Dwarka is going to be in deeper water.
Interesting. So what do you find of the coast of Mamallapuram? Like, what was the visual like?
Walls.
Walls. And sufficiently complex walls?
Oh, yes. Walls made of blocks, put together, walls with standout features, walls where I could put my diving knife into the gap between two blocks, walls that are largely covered by sand that's been drifted over them. But if you scrape the sand away, you find the wall goes down and down and down.
Oh, it goes further down.
It
so
goes
it's
further
a longer wall.
Yeah. And walls with curves in them. There's nobody's disputing that it's man-made. The only mystery is why no further research has been done since 2002.
And these are 12,000-year-old structures.
They got to be.
At least.
Yes, they got to be at that depth of submergence, yeah.
And is the stuff you're finding sufficiently complex to say that there is an element of intelligence to it? Or
oh yeah, it's as complex as the Indus Valley civilization. This is a proper urban structures that are found off the coast of Mamallapuram. They're not megaliths. These are not megalithic blocks.
These are not huge.
No. They're relatively manageable sized, but they are man-made walls. Look, I mean, the Indus Valley civilization, it's all mud brick because there wasn't a lot of stone there. These, in the case of Mamallapuram, it's stone, but they're not massive stones. They're this sort of size.
That sounds like a fairly... Because look, if I were imagining how I'd make sense of human history, the kind of pieces I would need is, first I'd need some kind of empirical piece, which is the mythology, right?
Yeah.
This is storytelling that people have been talking about.
Yeah.
Then I'd need to see something with naked eye. And I have the pyramids for that, or the Kailash Temple for that, or the Easter Island heads for that, and the Stonehenge, which is not too far from here.
Yeah.
These are all evidence of things we just don't know how to explain and why are they there. And all of them surprisingly have something to do with the stars. All of them have surprisingly something to do with these mathematical configurations that are true to astronomy.
Exactly.
And then I'd be like, okay, if A and B is correct, how can I extend it into predictive territory? How can I go A plus B is equal to C? So let's test out if C exists.
Yeah.
And if C exists, I need to dive, and I dive and I find that there are certain things. At that point, it seems like there is sufficient evidence.
I think so. I've thought that for a long time, particularly since these underwater structures are found all around the world. And I emphasize that my wife Santha and I, on our own resources, diving all around the world, have found man-made structures at great depth. What would happen if the entire resources of archaeology were put to work on this problem? If a really serious effort were made to investigate the continental shelves all around the world, I think it would be a revelation. I think we on our own limited resources just found the tip of the iceberg. I think that what's needed is a much larger, much more detailed project. But I think the case is already made that we are clearly missing something very important from our past. And I don't want to put a name on that, and I don't want to say exactly what that something was. What drives me, what's kept me going for more than 30 years on this track, is the sense of an unsolved mystery, of a missing... I almost visualize it like a dark shadow in our past. There's something missing there. And what drives me is the desire to fill in those missing areas and see what it is that we've forgotten.
You know, what's also very interesting is this recurrence of the number 7, about the 7 rishis or the 17. There's 7 civilizations popping up around 7,000. Why is that number significant? And
it's very odd. I don't understand it myself. I'll give you an obscure example. The temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt has 7 sages, 7 builder gods, and 7 creators. The number 7 keeps on coming up again and again and again. And particularly this notion of 7 sages, 7 rishis, 7 wise people. That's what keeps on. And they are teachers. They are teaching others how to live in a civilized society. That's what they are. And I'm beginning to wonder if there was the fact that there are 7 sages in ancient Sumer and 7 sages in ancient India and 7 sages in ancient Egypt and 7 sages, as I mentioned before, even in Easter Island. It looks to me like the echo of the memory of a project where survivors of the cataclysm, the Younger Dryas cataclysm, were sent out all around the world to make contact with other peoples, to connect with them. As survivors of our own civilization would do if our own civilization went down, if there was a huge cataclysm, those who survived would seek out other survivors, and it might be that actually they would do better by seeking out hunter-gatherers who know how to survive in this world. That's what I think happened at the end of the Ice Age. I think that after the Younger Dryas cataclysm, that there was a coordinated effort to send out emissaries to very many different parts of the world, and they went in groups of 7, and that's why it's the 7 sages.
Right.
But that's just a guess, I'm not claiming that this is a fact. I'm constantly working with theory and with speculation because that's all I can do. And I think it's right and proper to do that. Just as archaeology has this very hardline, limited, monopolistic focus on the past, I think it's good. It's a good thing that there are others like myself, and I'm not alone. There are many others working in this field who are bringing a different perspective to the problem.
It's, in my research, there's a very interesting fact that came up as part of Ramayana. We hear about how a mountain is picked up, and I'm cutting the story short by quite a lot, and moved from the Himalayas in the north of India all the way down to what is now modern Sri Lanka, or in the text is Lanka.
I've not heard that story.
Yes, it's a mountain that's now called the Dronagiri mountain.
Right.
And what I can come up with research, because there is so many layers of things when it comes to something like that, is that the flora on that mountain resembles that of the Himalayas.
Interesting.
Even though it's sufficiently far apart for that to not happen.
Right.
The Adams Bridge is a famous example.
Yes.
Right? The Ram Setu, which is, it's detailed out in a lot of story how that bridge gets built.
Yeah.
And although the bridge may not literally be there, but when we get satellite imagery, we realize there is a bridge.
You can see it. You can see it, and we know for sure it was much wider and much bigger during the Ice Age.
Right. And so then there are questions about how modern humans got to places like Australia without boats.
Very reasonable question, because the fact is that modern humans were in Australia 60,000 years ago. Modern humans were in Australia before they were in Europe.
What a strange thing.
What a strange thing
How
indeed.
do you get there?
I think that part of it is it shows us how unattractive Europe was during the Ice Age.
Right.
It's not a place you want to go.
Right.
You want to stay on the warmer latitudes. But then, how do they get all the way to Australia? There were stretches of ocean which had to be crossed, which could only have been crossed with boats and with knowledge and certainty that there was something at the other side. This is an issue when you are settling new territories as a culture. You don't want to send 2 or 3 people to a new territory because they're going to become extinct quite soon. You need to send large numbers of people, a breeding population who can reproduce, and they need to bring animals with them. They need to bring means of supply and sustenance. So that was not random or accidental that human beings ended up in Australia. That was the result of a series of decisions, of planned and careful decisions involving technology, involving ships that were capable of crossing those distances, and involving navigation. So we have to respect them for what they did. And if they were capable of doing that, what else were they capable of doing?
I mean, 60,000 years is a long period, but it does remind me of the fact there is a friend of mine, a previous guest on the show, who's a very famous economist out in India, who's fascinated by ancient Indian maritime history, took it upon himself to say that ancient Indian maritime techniques were fairly superior to what modern historians claim.
Yeah.
And he got a lot of pushback for that. So he built a ship.
Right.
Using all the techniques.
Yes.
And then he sailed it to Oman from the coast of Gujarat.
Brilliant.
And he managed to do it.
Yeah.
And it puts into perspective how little we might be imagining of our own history.
Totally.
Right? And it does actually, you've touched upon this quite a bit, at least in your speaking, if not in your writing. Because when we see all of this unexplainable stuff from our past, we see iconography, we see paintings, we see scripts, we see intelligent design of sorts, right? We see...
Totally.
And we also see things that look so impossible to have managed, like the pyramids, say what you will, were fairly impossible to manage. And we are now finding out even that there is another Sphinx facing the other direction buried near. Something of that nature?
There's been a little noise on the internet about that.
Right.
I'd be careful with that.
Okay.
But there is there is a possibility that what's recently been identified as a second sphinx is actually a spoil heap, and isn't. Keep an open mind on that. It's not settled yet. However, I was in Giza just 4 weeks ago, and there is there is a second sphinx at Giza. It's most curious. The Great Sphinx is about 270 feet long. It's perfectly oriented due east, so it faces the rising sun at dawn on the spring equinox. I have been traveling to Giza for more than 30 years, and it wasn't until an Egyptian friend of ours said, "Do you know there's a second sphinx on the Giza Plateau?" that I said, "Okay, show me." And it turns out that it is within 300 meters of the known sphinx. And what it is, it's a rock structure that in this case is oriented perfectly due west, not perfectly due east. It's got a head. It looks like at some point in the past, people began to turn a natural rock structure into a sphinx, but then they stopped. They didn't complete it. In many ways, from certain angles, it looks just like the Great Sphinx, but from other angles, it doesn't. It's an incomplete thing. So I wouldn't put too much weight on what's being said about a second sphinx, except to say that the ancient Egyptians saw everything in terms of duality, and it would be odd only to have one sphinx.
One sphinx.
Yeah.
The question I was leading into is the possibility of aliens. And that's a word that's loosely thrown around very often.
Yeah.
It's a word that's acquired a lot of connotation in discourse. And there is a lot of recent chatter. I don't know if you're tuned into that, with the government officially acknowledging some version of UFOs more recently.
Yeah, sure.
Right? I'm saying there's many angles through which this conversation arrives.
There are many that it could go. What it comes down to is that the explanations we are given by the so-called professionals in this field, the archaeologists, are not satisfactory for the problems we confront. And therefore, it's natural to look for alternatives. In my case, to explain those anomalies, I think the best explanation is a lost human civilization, which touched later civilizations. But I can understand why people say, oh, it must have been aliens. I get it, because there's a dearth of information. We are not getting satisfactory explanations from the professionals. So it's natural that we look for alternatives in this respect. Now, I have never been an advocate of the nuts and bolts physical aliens being responsible for building the Great Pyramid. For one reason alone, if not for many more, is precisely that human error in the construction of the Great Pyramid. If you're a hypothetical alien being who's crossed interstellar space at a fraction of light speed, or even at light speed, to get to planet Earth, your navigation is really, really good. I mean, it's perfect. And if your project, for God knows what reason, was to build a pyramid, you would not make an error in its orientation to true north. You'd get it right. So I just think I don't need nuts and bolts aliens. When I say nuts and bolts, one of my problems with the whole alien explanation or the alien argument is that it's so materialistic, that it's all based on material things, that they've just got this higher tech than us. They're like us, but got higher tech. I think the universe is filled with life. It's filled with consciousness. But whether that life and that consciousness has had anything to do with the construction of monuments on Earth, I seriously doubt. But I don't deny that it's filled with life. And I suspect that in many cases, that life is very different from our own.
So it does figure in your mental map that there is a possibility for that, not
Yes.
just in the way of explaining the last 15, 20,000 years.
Yeah, there's a possibility for what?
For interdimensional or whatever aliens, that kind of stuff.
Well,
nuts and
for
bolts.
sure. To me, it's just crazy to imagine that this entire majestic creation that we call the universe, that
It's
we're the only sentient beings in it. It
Right.
just seems very wasteful of the universe.
Right.
I mean, I come from my own experiences and my own place, but I think what life is all about is consciousness. Consciousness is fundamental. Physical life is secondary. That's why I like the idea of reincarnation. I think that consciousness can incarnate multiple times. Consciousness is at the core of it,
Right.
and I think the universe is filled with consciousness, and I think that's the point of the universe. That it's a kind of, this isn't a fact, this is just my speculations. That it's a kind of theater of experience where entities that are all consciousness come to have physical experiences with physical consequences, experiences that it's possible to learn from and to grow and to develop. That's the kind of framework in which I would put the whole story of life in the universe.
It's so interesting how much of that is reminiscent of just my education in culture, of how Indians are sort of raised with the idea that everything is sentient. And you have to acknowledge that.
That's a great thing about India. I think it's a really important realization, which completely goes against the tenor of Western science, where things are just things, matter is just matter. But why shouldn't consciousness be present in matter? It's present. We're matter, and consciousness is present in us. I think the ancient India idea that consciousness is everywhere is far more sophisticated and far more likely to be correct.
To comment about its sophistication is a different matter, but to even consider the fact that it's detailed enough in that it talks about reincarnation, all religions, all mythologies were concerned with what happens after life. And it seems like in that, if your central mission for any religion is what happens after life, religion is effectively a spiritual tool. It deals with reality on a spiritual level, and
except that some don't.
Yes, and I mean modern science has to.
Some religions, I will not go into detail, seem to me to be the opposite of spiritual.
Sure, I know what you mean by that, but as a concept, as a broader idea of knowledge being passed down through generations, through the thousands of years. It seemed like the adventure was to figure out the meaning of life and death and spirit.
For sure. Yeah.
And it's almost an unavoidable part. So much of it becomes, like talking to you, I realize, I don't know how well read you are in ancient Indian knowledge systems, but there is so much of this resonance that I'm like, oh yes, I know what the word for that is in my language. I know what the word for that is in my language. And I'm sure if I start going around to ancient civilizations, it happens when I go to Mexico, for instance, and you see that even though they're Christians, a lot of their practices are still built around the civilizations that preceded them.
Totally. Yeah.
And so you see the Festival of the Dead, which generally would not figure in modern civilization anywhere, except that they think of it as so important to speak to their ancestors that have passed. Very similar to what we have every year in India, where we actively speak to the ancestors that have passed. And so life and death sort of seem to coexist in that moment. I have maybe one last question, and I've wanted to sort of get an answer about this from you for a very long time. Is that, say you're right, and say it's only a matter of time before we figure out all the physical nuts and bolts, mathematical, measurable, scientific, archaeological evidence that we need, and that there are lost civilizations, possibly more than one. It's possible that it's not just the 13,000 years ago. There might have been many repetitions of this.
Could go much earlier,
Could go much earlier.
I'm open to that.
If that is true, how does that change today? What does that change about the world?
It changes everything, because we stop thinking about ourselves as the apex and the pinnacle of creation. And that's one of the big mistakes that is being made in technological society, that somehow the whole story of evolution has been to produce us. No, it hasn't. There have been multiple attempts. Things have gone wrong in the past. We are temporary. We are a temporary civilization. All civilizations are temporary. Even ancient Egypt, which lasted 3,000 years, was temporary. It ended. It came to an end. And I think that the realization that there have been past episodes of what we would recognize as civilization, and that they've been brought to a cataclysmic end, and that again and again humanity has to restart the journey, restart the adventure of being human, that this happens constantly, that it's a cycle, it's not a straight line, it's a cycle, exactly where Indian thinking gives us very powerful thought tools to work with. The realization that we're involved in a cyclical project rather than a linear project will change everything in the way that we look at the world.
Is there something I might have missed?
No,
Is there something I think I should have asked?
No, I don't think so.
Thank you so much for your time.
I think we did well.
Yeah, I hope you had fun. I think this was a great conversation.
I enjoyed the conversation very much. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.